welcome to this briefing on the Irish Fiscal Council's December 2020 Fiscal Assessment Report, Sustaining the Economy Through COVID-19. The Fiscal Council is an independent body with a mandate to assess the public finances, and that includes assessing and endorsing the macroeconomic forecasts, assessing budgetary projections, monitoring the fiscal rules, and assessing the overall fiscal stance. This Fiscal Assessment Report provides an assessment of the projections and policies set out in Budget 2021 in October. Let me begin by outlining the key messages. COVID-19 is having a major impact on the economy, but the outlook has improved, both since our report in May, but also with the good news about the vaccine in recent weeks. However, uncertainty is exceptionally high, both around how COVID-19 will play out over the coming months and around Brexit. In terms of the public finances, we expect the deficit will be around 10% of GNI star this year and about the same next year as well. For 2021, large temporary supports and stimulus of 12 billion euros are welcome and an appropriate response to the current circumstances. The 2.1 billion contingency and the 3.4 billion recovery fund are also helpful and contribute to good budgetary planning. However, Budget 2021 includes permanent increases in spending of 5.4 billion euros and possibly up to 8.5 billion. These permanent commitments, without identifying how they'll be funded sustainably, are not conducive to prudent budgetary management. There are significant fiscal pressures coming in future years from fiscal adjustment, ageing, reducing reliance on corporation tax, and climate change. The government must use its medium-term strategy in April to deliver credible plans about how it will address these challenges and meet its own objectives. And strengthening the fiscal framework and the spending review process would help in this process. Let me now go through in a bit more detail to explain the report's analysis that leads us to these conclusions. COVID-19 is having a major impact on the economy, but the outlook has improved since the spring. And you can see this in this chart. The dark green line shows the Budget 2021 forecast that went to 2021 and an extension that the Council has done. You can see the very sharp fall in the early part of 2020, how the economy has sharply picked up. We now expect, or the Department of Finance now expects growth to be relatively flat towards the end of 2021, and eventually the economy will start to pick up. This is a much better profile than the one that we had in May, that had a much sharper downturn. The recovery was faster, but from a much lower level. So this is essentially good news, and it doesn't really factor in the additional good news from the vaccine. However, the impact of this crisis, as we all know, is very complex. It's very differentiated. One business can be affected very differently from another. One individual can be affected very differently from another. It's a very complicated crisis, particularly for those sectors that rely on social interaction, restaurants, accommodation, transport, and the arts. And we can see some of that complexity in this chart on the left. The green bars show the average level of earnings essentially in different sectors, with the lower earning sectors such as retail and accommodation on the right. And you can see that the falls in activity over the past year, represented by the pink dots, this number of hours worked, has been much sharper in some of those sectors, while in other sectors, the number of hours worked is the same. In some, it's even increased. So it's a very differentiated shock. And of course, within these sectors, there'll be a lot of differences too. And looking across the country, looking at the different regions, box C of the Fiscal Assessment Report includes an analysis of the regional impact based on their sectoral exposure. And you can see that regions in the border, in the west and the southeast, that are more reliant on distribution, transport and hospitality have suffered deeper shocks in the early part of the year than Dublin, where the activity is skewed more towards other activities that have done relatively well. So it's a very complex shock, and that's a very difficult issue for us to analyse and also for policymakers to respond to. Against this background, uncertainty is still exceptionally high, both due to COVID, both what will happen over the winter, whether there will be new lockdowns when the vaccine is ready, but also to its economic impact, how much firms can stand of this disruption, and around Brexit at the end of the year. For this reason, the Council has again prepared 3 scenarios, as we did in the spring, out to 2025, to assess what these different paths of the economy might look like. The green line is the line we've seen already, is basically an extension of the budget 2021 forecasts. This assumes no vaccine until 2022 and a hard Brexit. The lighter blue line represents what would happen in a milder scenario. This is one where a Brexit deal is found, where there a sort of free trade agreement is put into place, where there is a vaccine sometime next year. And so we see that the recovery is faster and we get to a higher level quickly. On the other hand, we shouldn't ignore the fact there are downsides to this. It could be that the COVID crisis leads to repeated lockdowns next year. It could also be that the Brexit is much more complex. And in those cases, the recovery would be delayed and ultimately take us to a lower level of output. Looking across these three scenarios, we would expect activity to return to its end 2019 level, so the pre-crisis level, sometime between early 2022 and later in 2023. An important point to take from this chart too is the Department of Finance projections in the budget ended in 2021. This is much shorter than the usual medium-term 5-year kind of projection that they do. And this makes it very hard, I think, to assess where the economy is going and where the public finances are going. It's very important that the Department of Finance returns to its usual strategy of forecasting 5 years ahead. In terms of public finances, the deficit will be around, as I said, 10% of GNI star, both in 2020 and in 2021. And on the left, you can see the profile's a bit different. We initially thought it was going to be worse this year and then pick up. In fact, it's going to be kind of similar across the 2 years, probably. And the chart on the right gives you some insights as to what's happening. We basically saw revenue fall a lot. It's come back a fair bit, but it's still lower than it was a year ago. And on the other hand, expenditure really ticked up with the COVID crisis and is essentially staying at similar levels. For this year, this outturn is much better than expected, and that essentially reflects much better news over the summer about revenues, which is more than offset the fact that a number of additional spending measures were taken, particularly over the summer, that tended to increase the deficit. But we're still looking at a budget balance this year, a budget deficit, a very large deficit of a little bit over 20 billion euros. But this is much less than the sort of 25 billion people might have had in the spring, or even the 30 billion people were talking about. So this is a much better outcome than people anticipated. It may be a little bit worse than this because of the tier 5, level 5 measures at the end of this year. They probably add about 1.8 billion to the deficit in the final months of this year. That could be offset by other things, but so the deficit might be more like 11%. But it's still much better than people were expecting. Now, looking a little bit behind this, as I said, revenue has fallen but has recovered, and it's also proven much more resilient. The left-hand chart gives you some insights as to why that resilience has taken place. If you looked at VAT, this is the cumulative fall in revenue since last year, essentially. And if you look, there's been a very big fall in VAT as consumption has fallen, as people don't go out to restaurants, hotels, and so forth. You can also see the sort of marine, the aqua color at the bottom, that the PRSI receipts have fallen quite a bit. But there have been two sources of resilience. One is the pink bars, which represent corporation tax, which has again surprised very substantially on the upside this year. We don't yet have the full picture for that. But also, if you look at the green bars, which is the fall in income tax, that has been surprisingly small, given the fall in activity. And the reason for that is suggested on the chart on the right, which is had income tax fallen as much as income had fallen, represented by this green bar here, we would have expected a much, much bigger fall in income tax than what we actually saw, which is represented by the little dot. And that's partly because revenues were very strong at the beginning of the year, but it's also because of the progressive nature of the tax system. As we saw earlier, many of the people who've lost their jobs and lost incomes were at the lower end of the pay scale, and so not paying a huge income tax system, while high earners, those who under a progressive system tend to pay more, have actually kept their income. So as a result, the overall fall in income tax is much less than we would have expected. Of course, the flip side of that is going into next year, we would also expect much less of a recovery than would usually be the case. On the spending side, what's essentially a lot of this year's activity has essentially been driven by large temporary supports and stimulus. These will support the economy in both 2020 and 2021. Looking at this measure of net policy spending, which is one way of measuring spending, on the left-hand side, you can see how the spending around COVID built up this year. There was an original package of measures in March and around April. During the summer, a very substantial package of measures was introduced, and a few more measures were introduced in budget 2021. So that by budget date, the total amount of COVID-related spending in the economy in this net spending measure was 17 billion euros for 2020. And we can add a little bit on to that because of the measures announced since, because of level 5. On the right-hand side, you can see the same analysis for 2021. Some measures in the summer already would have gone into 2021. The budget announced a set of additional measures. There's also the recovery fund. We don't have a lot of detail about that, but the idea is that will be spent in the coming year. And there is also a contingency. Taking all of that together, we reach a total of 12.8 billion of spending. So less than we had in 2020, reflecting the fact that the crisis is probably going to be less severe in its impact in 2021. The allocation of a 2.1 billion contingency, as well as the recovery fund, helps good budgeting. One of the problems we had this year is that the spending was sort of announced a little bit ad hoc and was building up, so it was quite hard to keep track of the public finances. For 2021, there's already an amount of money there that can cover COVID-related contingencies. This is something that the council argued for in its pre-budget statement, so it's very welcome. And this gives you an example of why that's necessary. This shows what's happened on the left-hand side to number of pandemic unemployment payment claimants. It's basically gone up very substantially since level 5 measures were introduced. On the right-hand side, you can see that in terms of costs together with the short work scheme. And again, you can see that's picked up a lot. So this is very helpful should there be additional lockdowns early next year, which weren't budgeted for, or weren't budgeted for explicitly. And also that these schemes end in March. Now, it may be those schemes are required beyond the end of March. And in that case, it's very helpful this contingency has been allowed for. So the large-scale support and counter-cyclical stimulus measures in budget 2021 are appropriate. These are huge numbers in terms of the deficit and in terms of the borrowing implied, but they are very appropriate to support the economy. And these charts show why. On the left-hand side, you can see that many sectors of the economy are still see thousands of people availing of support measures. So these support measures are still very much needed, both to support the incomes of these people, but also to make sure that the supply capacity of the economy is still there, that people are still connected to their firms as the health situation improves, hopefully. But on the right-hand side, we also see more broadly that we expect there to be substantial spare capacity in the coming years. This shows the Council's measure of the output gap. We think the economy was overheating a little bit coming into the COVID crisis, but not by very much. We now see that in the early part of the year, activity was well below its potential. And though that gap will narrow as the economy recovers, there is still going to be spare capacity. And so it's very helpful that policy continues to support the economy. Another welcome aspect of the budget measures was that public investment, which is a very powerful way of stimulating the economy and has the additional benefit of contributing to growth in public services in the future, is a key instrument in the stimulus. In fact, public spending was set to rise anyway, and you can see on the left how it's been rising in billions and as a share of GNI star. Some measures were brought forward or increased in the budget. So overall, we have a strong component of public investment. And if you look on the right-hand side, compared to a normal level in a European country, we're going to see quite strong levels of public investment in the years to come. However, Budget 2021 also included 5.4 billion and possibly over 8 billion of permanent spending measures. These are measures that are not related to COVID, that wouldn't be expected to fall away as the health situation improves. These are permanent measures. If you look on the left-hand side, you can see total general government spending in 2019, 2020, and 2021. You can see that in 2020, there was a large rise, and much of that was accounted by temporary spending related to COVID, the 17 billion that we saw a few slides back. But in 2021, less of that increase is due to temporary measures, and more of it is due to these permanent increases in spending. So if you look at these darker green bars on the left, you can see that ongoing spending in 2021 will be some 9 billion euros higher than it was in 2019. And this is part of the strategy set out in the expenditure report with the budget of having a dual strategy of both spending additional money related to COVID, but also continuing to ramp up spending on public services. And on the right-hand side, you can see that this permanent increase in spending is spread quite evenly across a number of areas of government spending. There's quite a big amount for health, quite a big amount for education, but also social protection, housing and transport. On the Exchequer side, that amounts to some 5.4 billion. In terms of the general government, where we have a bit less of a handle on things, there's an additional 3 billion, and that's potentially what takes us up to 8.4 or 8.5 billion. One of the difficulties is that this pink area outside the Exchequer, so this is spending by local authorities, by the semi-state bodies, extra budgetary funds, we have very little information about this. This was also an issue in the previous budget. It's becoming quite an important part of spending or changes in spending, and there's very little information on the budgetary, what it actually is, and also the nature of that spending, whether it's current spending, whether it's capital spending, whether it's planned to extend beyond 2021 or beyond or whether it's supposed to end then. So much greater transparency is needed on general government developments, and we make more detailed suggestions on that in the report. Another way of looking at these measures, the permanent nature of them, is in terms of staff increases. The budget includes very substantial increases in the number of public sector workers. So overall, the increase is close to 6% in 2021. That's an increase of around 17,000 people working for the government. In some areas, such as health, that's very considerable, but also in areas like children and across a number of other government areas. These are spending commitments that are likely to last well beyond the COVID crisis. The Council assesses that large increases in permanent spending of this nature without identifying sustainable funding is not appropriate. To be clear, we're not saying that increasing public spending is not appropriate. It can be in some circumstances. We're also not saying that borrowing money temporarily is inappropriate. What we are saying is that making permanent increases in spending that will potentially be there long after the crisis, without identifying how it's going to be funded, risks adding to budgetary pressures, risks creating fiscal imbalances in the years to come. Essentially, it creates a bit of a hole in the public finances. And at a time where we don't know exactly where revenues are going to be, but where we're likely on a lower path than we were before, having these big increases in spending is a potentially risky strategy. And the increases are very large. If you look at this left-hand chart, which is a chart of this net policy spending measure, you can see that the 5.4 or even the 8.5 would be amongst the largest increases in net policy spending in recent years, and very much on a par with a very big increase in 2018. Now, there are some issues about splitting out the temporary and the permanent aspects, partly related to the general government that I discussed in the previous slide, also related to health spending. The core part of health spending appears not to have grown very much this year. It's obviously very complicated because the demands on the health service have been very different. But I think even if you look across the 2 years, you see that this is a very considerable increase in permanent spending at a time where there's a lot of uncertainty about how much revenue the economy is going to generate in the coming years, and without a strategy being put in place to finance it. And added to that is the fact that the programme for government rules out many revenue or spending adjustments that could otherwise have been used to meet this additional spending increase. So if you look at the left-hand side, the pink area is the area where there were explicit commitments not to make major tax changes. The grey area is areas where there was no commitments were made, and the only areas that were cited for possible tax increases were a very small part of the overall tax base. And it's worth bearing in mind that, for example, a 1 percentage point increase in the PRSO rate only raises about 750 million. So it's small relative to the kind of spending increases that we've seen. And on the expenditure side, there are also commitments to protect spending across almost half of spending. And so this will make it much more difficult in the years ahead to achieve fiscal adjustment if that's needed. Looking at that medium term, the budget balance is, of course, expected to improve, including taking into account the permanent spending increases I just mentioned. That's essentially in the short term, because a lot of the temporary measures related to COVID should fall out by about 2022. So very quickly, the budget balance should improve. And then beyond that, growth will help to reduce it. In the extended scenario, we'll probably still end up with quite a big budget deficit, so around 2% of GNI star, or around 5 billion euros in 2025, in the absence of any policy measures. In a milder scenario, we could end up with a small budget balance again, but repeated waves could mean, or a much worse Brexit could mean, that the budget deficit is considerably larger at that point. In terms of the debt ratio, in most scenarios, we would see that falling. In the extended budget scenario, we get up to about 115% of GNI star next year. But basically, because of the favorable debt dynamics, so the chart on the right shows how interest payments have been, projected interest payments have been revised down in successive budgets. And you can see that's happened again, and we expect interest payments to fall yet again. That this is a very favorable environment in terms of the public finances. Obviously risks around that, but it's very encouraging. And to give one very interesting example, the government refinanced 17 billion euros of bonds this year. Previously, they were paying 800 million a year in interest. They're now paying 36 million a year in interest. So this chart can seem very abstract, but if you look at it in cash terms, it's a phenomenally favorable environment for government borrowing. But there are risks further ahead if this were to change. And once the recovery is underway, the government will face 4 major challenges to the public finances. So here we're really talking about 2022, 23, and out to 24, 25. The first challenge is ensuring that debt is on a downward path. The second is dealing with population aging. The third is reducing over-reliance on corporation tax. And the fourth is tackling climate change. Let me go through those in order. So the first thing is that debt will be at a very high rate. The debt to national income will start around 115% in 2021. This is a very uncomfortable level of public debt and leaves the public finances at risk either to a future increase in interest rates, or to a shortfall in growth, or to any kind of other negative shock that the economy might experience. It will be therefore important, once the recovery has taken hold, to put debt on a downward path, and this may require fiscal adjustment. The chart on the left shows a decomposition of the general government balance. This is the number we've seen before, around 10% next 2 years. And if you can see, that will improve a lot because of these grey areas, which are one-offs related to COVID. There's also a cyclical component that will unwind, but the structural balance, the red area, will also need to be addressed. We will have a structural deficit most likely in 2020 and 2021. And if you see the deterioration since 2019, that's a deterioration of almost 4 percentage points in the estimated structural balance. Of course, there's a lot of uncertainty around this, but it does show how the underlying position of the public finances has deteriorated. In terms of how much adjustment might be required to put debt back on the same path it was in 2019, so it'll be at a higher level, but coming down at the same rate. In the extended scenario, this would probably require fiscal adjustment of around 3 billion euros. In a mild scenario, it might not require very much. In repeated waves, it might require more. So as we said in the spring, it's very, very, very unlikely that we will need to return to anything like the severe austerity that we saw in 2008 and 2014, but it also means that it is a difficult environment for the public finances, particularly when you take into account the challenges the other challenges that we'll discuss in a moment. The second challenge is around population aging. So over the summer, the Council put out its long-term sustainability report, which is linked there, which provides a much deeper and more comprehensive analysis of aging pressures. But these aren't just a long-term issue. Aging will add around 850 million euros on average to public spending each year until 2025. So every year, the government needs to find another 850 million just to provide pensions and healthcare to an aging population. And over the long term, of course, this has much bigger implications. You can see on the left how health and pension spending will be expected to rise under current policies. Pension spending from about 8 to about 12% by 2050. Health spending from about 8 to around 13%. And if you look at this in terms of debt on the right-hand side, you can see that if we get debt to this sort of same downward path we had before, and you keep policies there, you would have this green area here. You would see debt would come down pretty fast as a ratio to somewhere below 60%. But if the aging and pensions and health pressures are not met, you would see that this would essentially lead to larger deficits than you would otherwise have. Debt wouldn't go that far below 100%, and it would pick up quite steeply from the 2030s. So these issues do need to be addressed, and the sooner they're addressed, the easier the adjustment will be. In that context, delaying the rise in the retirement age planned for 2021 adds to these long-term fiscal pressures and to a short-term pressure as well. However, the creation of the Pensions Commission is welcome, and the Council looks forward to engaging with them later this week. The third pressure is that the economy and revenues are too reliant on corporation tax. Though this has been a positive thing this year, it's been the one bright piece of news in terms of tax revenues this year. 1 in 5 euros of exchequer revenues is coming from corporation tax. These revenues are potentially very volatile. It's very much dependent on the relatively small number of companies and sectors and industries. And it could be affected by changes in international tax policy, whether that's the G20 OECD initiative, whether that's European policy, or whether it's policies in the United States. And as we can see from the right, a lot of the corporation tax are what we estimate to be excess. They're out of line with what we can explain based on historical patterns, or based on experience with other countries. So this reliance does need to be reduced during the crisis, after the crisis. It's been helpful now, but this long-term reliance is a source of vulnerability to the public finances. The fourth aspect is climate change and the energy transition. These may have important fiscal costs in the years ahead. While the introduction of a carbon tax is a welcome measure in terms of helping to reduce emissions, those incomes from it have essentially been allocated to a number of activities already. So it's not really going to be there to help to fill some of these other holes that may emerge in the public finances. And you can see the key issue is that projected emissions in 2030 on the left are much higher than the ceiling on the right. Now, some measures have already been put into place to reduce that, but a lot of additional effort is required. Now, some of this may have positive effects for growth or for revenues, but it's likely that some of this will have fiscal costs, and the government needs to set out a plan that's costed in terms of how it will achieve these things. So, with these pressures around the public finances, the government should use its medium-term strategy in April, as they've promised, to deliver credible plans for the medium term. The strategy should set out how the government's policy objectives and competing demands will be managed and fiscal sustainability achieved. In the report, we set out some details of how we expect that a credible plan would be set out. That should include 5-year expenditure projections that take into account the cost of providing existing public services, as well as any policy changes. 5-year revenue projections outlining how the major tax heads could be adjusted. Third will be to provide transparent costings of major changes in policy. And this is particularly true of the implementation of Sláinte Care. The most recent estimates of that are now 3 or 4 years old. Obviously, a lot of things have changed since then, and it will be very important when embarking on such a major initiative, and particularly with the recent history of budgeting problems in health, that good costings are made, and those are made available to people to look at. Fourth element is to show how this will be consistent with the fiscal objectives. The fifth is to provide guidance on how these plans will be adapted if revenue falls short of expectations. And the final element is to develop annual spending reviews into a more comprehensive review process. Though a lot of documentation was produced with the budget in terms of the spending review, most of this is very descriptive and kind of quite technical in its nature. Countries like the Netherlands show how this review process can really be an integral part of allocating spending in an evidence-based way, of looking for cost savings where they can be found, so as to free up revenues to better uses. So this is something that could definitely be developed. And of course, the final element is that medium-term stability should be supported by the fiscal framework. The domestic and EU rules allow for flexibility in 2020, rightly recognizing the exceptional circumstances. This looks likely to continue in 2021, but Ireland will still enter an excessive deficit procedure because our deficit is well over 3%. And eventually the rules should kick in at that point, or something different may come into place. There are 3 measures that the Council thinks the government could focus on as part of its medium-term plans to strengthen the fiscal framework. One is that given the high level of debt, developing debt ratio targets could be very effective. The second, and they should be specified in terms of GNI Star. The second is to enhance the role of the rainy day fund and perhaps a prudent savings account. This could be a very important instrument during the recovery phase in terms of helping to reduce the reliance on corporation tax. And the third aspect, as the economy recovered, is setting sustainable spending limits and an effective system of expenditure ceilings. So let me just finish with the key messages of this report. The deficit will be very large this year, around 10% of GNI Star, and probably around the same level next year. For 2021, large temporary supports and stimulus of 12 billion are welcome. In addition, the 2.1 contingency and the 3.4 billion recovery fund are helpful, and not allocating all of that money up front is a good way of adapting as circumstances change. However, Budget 2021 also included permanent increases in spending of 5.4 billion, possibly up to 8.5 billion. These permanent commitments, without identifying how they will be financed sustainably, are not conducive to prudent budgetary management. As I said earlier, increasing spending in this way in itself is not a problem. Borrowing temporarily during a downturn to stimulate the economy is also an appropriate policy. But having permanent measures in spending without explaining how they're going to be funded in the long term adds to fiscal pressures in the long run, and potentially adds a risk to sustainability in the medium term. And there are significant pressures in future years from other areas, from fiscal adjustment, from aging, reducing over-reliance on corporation tax, and climate change. So it's vital that the government should use its medium-term strategy in April to deliver credible plans to explain how it will deliver on the programme for government's aspirations, but also how it will manage these competing pressures. And strengthening the fiscal framework and spending reviews would help a lot in this regard. Thank you very much.